What's going on, watch fans? Welcome back to Forward Momentum. I'm your host, Todd Searle. I'm here with a guest today who I met at Geneva Watch Days, but I have long wanted to meet. He is an incredible watchmaker who is very, very involved in the deeply technical sides of watchmaking. He is one of my watchmaking heroes, and I am very pleased to welcome Stephen McDonnell to Forward Momentum. Stephen, how are you?
I'm very well, Todd. Thank you for the very kind and generous introduction. That's very exciting. I hope I can live up to that.
I know you can, and I know that I'm really excited to speak with you today because you, as people might guess from your name and your accent, are not Swiss or French, so you end up being a bit of an anomaly in the watch industry. I'd love to hear how you got started in watches and what it was like going to WOSTEP and what initially drew you into watchmaking.
Well, now there's a story, huh? It's true. So yeah, I'm not Swiss at all. I'm from Northern Ireland. I'm from Belfast. I suppose the thing is that people sometimes ask me, and it's a pretentious answer. It sounds like a pretentious answer to say that I never chose watchmaking. It feels like watchmaking chose me. You know, I was totally obsessed with it from the age of about 4 or 5 years old. You know, I never sought it out. There's nobody else involved in my family. There's no other history here, and in terms of me and my family and people that I knew. And the thing as well about Northern Ireland is it's a country where there's no culture of watchmaking whatsoever. It's not known. You'd never consider as a career. You know, the difference is in Switzerland, you're surrounded by the whole industry. You're surrounded by the culture. You can't avoid it. Here, that's unknown. So a person growing up here would never think that they would, become a watchmaker. So it's something I was always intensely interested in as a small child. I was given a clock by my grandfather, which he dug up in his attic when I was about 4 years old, 5 years old. He gave me this clock, and I just thought it was the most wonderful thing I had ever seen. I was just obsessed with it, and it was broken. And, after with some help from a local, a sort of semi-retired watchmaker, watch repairer, this guy was able to give me the parts. He didn't repair the clock. He gave me the parts the clock needed, and he gave me some tools. And I was able eventually to get this thing working when I was about 8. And that was my sort of, road to Damascus moment, St. Paul on the road to Damascus moment. That's the red line in my life, was that clock, getting that clock running. And I think from then on, there was no way that I couldn't avoid it. But as I say, there was still no culture of that here. And I never thought I'm going to become a watchmaker or some work in horology. I just thought this is an intense interest, which I have privately, which I will keep as my interest, and that will always be something I'm doing, myself. But I never thought of it as a career until much later. So it's a sort of a circuitous path. I grew up and I thought, okay, well, I went to university and I have a degree in theology, which has got nothing to do with anything really at all. I'm not religious, but I'm just fascinated by all that sort of stuff. But it was only after doing that this watch and clock thing, it just wouldn't go away. I couldn't shake it off, And after that, it was only after I had been to university and come back that I started to repair all these clocks for these local, antique dealers and jewelers and stuff. And then this word WOSTEP kept coming up in people's conversations. I started hearing about this mythical WOSTEP thing, and I realized maybe this is something I could try for, little me from Northern Ireland. And I suppose, to cut a long story very short, I did apply and I got in. And that was the first time I'd ever had that. Going to WOSTEP was the first time I had any formal training at all in any kind of horology, So that was January 2001. I went there to do the 6-month refresher course, or not even 5 months refresher course. And then I was going to do that and come home again. That was grand. And then I ended up staying in Switzerland for 13 and a half years by accident.
And just to refresh people who are listening, WOSTEP is the Watchmakers of Switzerland Training and Education Program.
That's the one. Yeah.
It's different tiers, right? So like you come in and you could do the basic course or the refresher, and then there are different technical courses as you go.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So the course I did was the refresher course, which is a course. It's a really good course, because people who are watchmaking in all sorts of different countries. They work in different levels. So somebody might have grown up and maybe worked with their dad or been taught by their dad, or somebody might have gone to a watchmaking school in a different country, or somebody might have taught themselves and sort of started a business, or so you have all these different things going on, and the idea of the refresher course is it brings all these different people who have got previous experience, but to differing levels, brings them all together and sort of puts them all at a single level. So whenever you graduate from that course, it means that everybody knows what that stands for. So everybody can do all these things up to that refresher course type level.
Yeah.
So it's really, it's not a full training course. It's for people who have previous experience, because I had already worked and I've been playing around with, I've been playing with clocks and watches for years, so it wouldn't have been appropriate for me to start with the full training course, which is a different course, which runs for more like 2 years, which really starts from zero. There wouldn't have been any point in me doing that. So the refresher course was the way in, but as a result, I thought I would just do this refresher course and then go back to Belfast and, continue tootling around. But I stayed, and my life took a path I hadn't at all foreseen. It's strange.
Yeah. And so when you stayed in Switzerland, you got sort of much more into the deeply technical side of watchmaking. How did you progress from that refresher course into the deeper and deeper technical levels of watchmaking?
The first couple of years were like the learning curve was like vertical. I always say that, it was unbelievable. It was the most intense. The first 2 years, the most intense 2 years I ever. I mean, it was wonderful, really. I sort of compared it to like Harry Potter going to Hogwarts.
Yeah.
Suddenly you're in a place where everything, it all made sense. My whole life suddenly made sense. I was finally in the place where I was supposed to be. Although I hadn't seen it like that until I got there. I didn't realize it really until I got there. All the bits of the puzzle all just fell into place. And here I was in this place where I'm supposed to be. Turns out I seem to be quite good at it, and it was the most wonderful, incredible. I feel very fortunate to have had that experience. I think that very few people get a chance to live any part of their life to that level of sort of white hot intensity, and that's really how it felt. But so you're right. Yeah, I was always drawn to the really technical side of things. It's what really interested me. I'd always been mad about, as I say, not just clocks, but all sorts of engines, gearboxes. Gearboxes especially, really, really like gearboxes. And I'd always been mad about this sort of stuff. So as soon as I got there, yeah, I was really interested in going further and further and further and further with that. So I did the refresher course, and then WOSTEP proposed that I should stay on and become an instructor. That was how I ended up actually staying, and I did that. So I became like Voutilainen's assistant for sort of a year, and then I was his student on the restoration and connotations course. That was in the second half of 2002. And, the more I went in the technical side, the more I wanted to go even further and even further in the technical side, So I was particularly drawn. I never wanted to just work in after sales service or anything like that. I wanted to really go as far as I possibly could with the technical stuff. It just absolutely enthralled me. I was just completely consumed by this devouring interest, which just the more I got into it, the more I was interested in getting more into it. So it's a kind of it's like a vicious circle of insanity.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I have a question. As a kid, were you playing with like gearboxes and cars and bikes and other, you talked about the clock that your grandfather gave you. Were you working on other mechanical objects as a kid?
It was mostly clocks, but yeah, also bicycles and steam engines. Obsessed with steam engines. It was just, and again, one of my lifelong huge interests is steam engines and the amount of beauty. You see, it's all about beauty, Todd. There's so much beauty in these things. So as a kid, I was like, it's funny actually. I was at my mum's house a couple of weeks ago. From my primary school. My primary school was a little school here in Northern Ireland, and they did this annual sort of school magazine, and all the kids would do like a wee contribution, and they'd write a wee something, and then you get your thing put in the school magazine. So I knew these were in the attic, and I've been meaning to dig them out for years and years. I dug them out a couple of weeks ago, and there's this one magazine from let me see, it's 1985. So in 1985, I'm 10. There's a whole page long article which I wrote, and it's called An Unusual Hobby. And it's a whole page about me and my interest in clocks and all the clocks that I have. Because I was sort of endlessly buying clocks from antique markets cheaply and taking them apart, repairing them, and repairing clocks for my teachers. And when I was only a kid, I was only 10 years old at this point. And I hadn't looked at this, hadn't seen this article in, I don't know, 20, 30 years. It was just hidden in the attic, and I dug this little magazine out. It was really funny to see it. It reminded me how sort of strong my interest was from such a young age. As I say, I never made a decision, maybe I'd quite like to be a watchmaker. It was something which was, it's kind of from, I don't know, I was pre-programmed from before birth or something. I don't know. I can't explain that, but it was never something which I one day thought, that might be an interesting career. It was like, it's like oxygen, you're not even conscious of seeking it out. It's just, I always had this interest, So yeah, it was mostly clocks, but also, as I say, steam engines as well. I was hugely interested in steam engines and steam trains and how those things work, but always in the sort of the really refined side of how those things work, not the brutal sort of ones made from pig iron right at the start. I love the sort of, whenever those technologies were sort of perfected in the early 20th century, that's the era that I'm really interested in terms of that sort of technology,
Amazing. That's awesome. I would love to see that article if you're willing to share, just because it's like,
yeah.
I guess you don't often meet people, or it's rare to meet people who just kind of were called to something and have been into it. And I'm always fascinated by people who are just like, this was just something that happened and you were just in it from the very beginning. And from a collector side and from a watch enthusiast side, I am so grateful that you are in this, because you have created some amazing, amazing movements in your time. And I know there's a lot of stuff that we can't talk about, or that we'll probably never really know about. But I know that there is some stuff that we can talk about. And I'd love to kind of talk about from WOSTEP and your time with Kari to meeting Max and working with MB&F, and how that relationship kind of developed.
Well, yeah, so I was at WOSTEP until I was teaching. So I stayed on to become an instructor, and I did become an instructor. So then I was teaching sort of 2003, 4, 5, 6, and I left WOSTEP mid 2006, 2007, around then, and I became independent, So the teaching was cool. I liked it. I really liked working with the students. That was really interesting. But I was never born to be a teacher. I think it was just, my first thing was always watchmaking. So I was a watchmaker. I was a watchmaker who happened to be teaching for a while, as opposed to a teacher who was teaching watchmaking. Teaching was never my first love, So I did it for a while. It was cool. And then I left, became independent. And, watchmaking's a small world. I lived in Neuchâtel. Neuchâtel's where WOSTEP is, so that's where I've been living from the beginning of 2001. And, I quickly became friends with lots of people in the watch industry around there, And one of those is my dear pal, Stephen McDonnell, who's a very well-known independent fellow, he was just here staying with me last weekend, actually. And, through Stephen's very well connected, and Stephen had worked in the industry quite a lot before I got to know him. So he was well connected. He put me in touch with, people like Peter Speake, so I became very friendly with Peter, and Peter and I got on well. And Peter had me, once I became independent, Peter had me doing all sorts of like assembling. I was doing tourbillons for him and perpetual calendars and bits and pieces, And so it was really through Peter that I started to design stuff, because at that point I wasn't a designer. You see, I was working all that time. Been working for, after WOSTEP, I'd been, even before, during WOSTEP, I'd been sort of moonlighting, doing like stuff for Christoph Kari. I was doing like tourbillons and minute repeaters and all those sort of assemblies, chronographs, those complicated watches. I've been doing that a bit on the side, while I was at WOSTEP the last couple of years, to make extra money so that I could start to buy all the equipment and machinery, which is sitting beside me just out of shop.
I was just going to ask about that, so we'll come back to how you set up your workshop in Belfast, because I'm endlessly curious how you got everything safely from Switzerland to your workshop.
I know, I'm amazed as well. I don't know how it works. So that was all. I'd been doing that. So I'd been working on all these complicated watches, and then with Peter, I was doing assembly and putting kits together and stuff. But I'd never designed anything. And it was really Peter. Peter for me is really an important guy in the story, because it was Peter who pushed me to start to design something. Peter was the guy who I said before, he saw something about me. I didn't know what he saw at that point at all. But he said, "You've got to start designing," and it was him who encouraged me to learn CAD. And CAD's a very important step in this whole watch design business, So I did that. I stopped work completely because I was just by myself. I stopped everything else and I just learned CAD for 3 months. So I took unpaid. And from there, then I was able to start to take my very first sort of baby steps in terms of designing stuff. So I designed some mechanisms for Peter. We did a couple of 2 or 3 wee sort of not complete watches, but we sort of unique pieces with modules. So I designed and completely made the whole module, made all the components, even the screws, the whole thing, top to bottom, did all the finishing, all the decoration, made that was like a wee jumping R thing and this thing with 3 sets of hands. I can show you some pictures if you're curious.
Yeah, that would be
awesome. So
amazing.
I did all these for Peter, and then Peter was obviously, he was involved in the very first horological machine #1, which he was one of the friends on that watch, So actually, it was through Peter then that I got involved with Max, because Max had problems with the first watch. Peter was one of the friends on it, so whenever it came to sorting out the problems, I was one of the people that Peter called. So it was from there that I met Max, and I suppose there again we got on, and we remained in contact, I suppose, to some extent. So, but it begins like that. So, at that point, I have to understand, at that point, I wasn't a watch designer. I was a watchmaker. My whole background was in the with the machines at the bench, the actual watchmaking side of stuff. I was a watchmaker who was starting to take his first tentative steps towards designing things.
Yeah, absolutely.
But then at that point, I met Max, and I got involved in his project. But in his project, again, I wasn't. I had nothing to do with the design of that watch. I was involved purely in solving the technical problems and getting the first watches together, because Max had problems with the company he was doing it with, and the thing hadn't been prototyped, and there was lots of bits weren't working properly, and lots of bits were missing, and so on. So there's a few of us watchmakers who Peter assembled, who we sort of sorted all that out for Max.
Yeah. Yeah. And was that sort of like, I know that there's a long story there about, there were some components there were pieces missing, there were no actual technical plans for this. Was that the kind of puzzle that you just dove into and loved attacking, trying to figure it out?
Yeah, I really loved it. Yeah, I thought it was brilliant. It was really exactly the sort of thing I was interested in, and I was really keen to get it done and get it working and see what it looked like. I thought it was a really interesting puzzle. I liked the way that it was, exactly as you say, it wasn't, it didn't just, you didn't just, put all the bits together and it all worked. It involved a challenge, and it involved, machining all sorts of stuff and modifying parts and working out what goes where and what was wrong. And okay, this bit doesn't work properly, so how are we going to redesign that? So it was a really interesting challenge, yeah. And I enjoyed getting my teeth into it, And I suppose Max saw that about me. He saw that I sort of, I was quite keen on stuff like that. And then again, it's the same thing. The technical side, I really like the technical side, getting into the technical side of it. So I suppose that's where that we had a common interest, I suppose, with Max, and that he saw that I was somebody who liked that sort of, sadistic approach to things.
And then you've learned CAD, you've built some modules, you've done some designs. When did you start really thinking about sort of complications that you liked, but that you thought needed a complete rethink? I'm thinking, for example, the Legacy Machine Perpetual, with your perpetual calendar design that is completely unique to everything else that has been made to this point in time.
Okay. Well, yeah. Well, what happened? It's a ridiculous story, really. What happened was that I was working on something else. I was working on a thing through Peter. we were working on like a large project, and there was like an investor involved in that project, and I'd been at that for quite a long time. And then, unbeknownst to either of us, I suppose really the investor just he I don't know, he reorganized his portfolio and decided he didn't want to be involved in this project anymore, and he didn't give us any warning. So suddenly there was I basically had no income, just like that, bang. And so Peter and I had a sort of emergency meeting, and we said, right, what are we going to do? Because I had no income. And Peter said, okay, well, one of the little mechanisms I had come up with in that watch. That was quite an interesting watch, but unfortunately it never saw the light of day. But one of the things I'd come up with for that watch, Peter said, okay, let's take that. We'll make that into a little mini project. We'll do a module. We'll take an existing base movement. We'll do a new module featuring this mechanism. And this is this thing I mentioned, which is it's got 3 sets of hour-minute hands, which all move exactly in sync. So just to explain very quickly, normally with any hour-minute hands, you'll have, if you've got to set the time, you'll have play in the teeth. There's always play in the gears. That means that if you turn the crown to rotate the hands clockwise, and then you change direction with the crown, there'll be a lag between when you change the direction and when the hands actually start to move. And that's because all the play in the gears has to be taken up in one direction, then in the other. So it doesn't matter too much if you've only got 1 set of hour-minute hands, but if you've got 3 sets, you'll see that they'll all respond at different times, which would look terrible. So what this mechanism does is it's effectively a system to eliminate all the play from the gear trains. So each of the gear trains for each set of hands is double. There's a top set and a bottom set, and they're linked by a little spring. So the spring creates an artificial tension in the gear trains, which means that there's absolutely no lag between how you rotate the crown and how the hands all respond absolutely instantaneously, crisply. So that's what it does. And so I in 6 weeks, I designed the module, designed all the components, made the whole thing from scratch in the workshop, worked at like 10:30 at night every night. And this was just before Basel. And then it was finished like 2 days before Basel. Peter came and took it. And the idea was he was going to sell it, so we had some cash. And then I said to him, look, if you're going to go, do me one favor, please show it to Max and tell him I did it. So Peter stuck it in his pocket and away he went. And he did show it to Max, and I think Max was suitably impressed. And, that was I sort of wanted this as a sort of calling card, to say to Max, this is what I'm doing now. I sort of thought, well, maybe I might have a punt and ask Max if he'd like to do something, or he'd like me to do something. I just didn't have the nerve to ask by myself. So I kind of sent Peter this watch, and I sort of wanted the watch to do the talking, and Peter just sort of say something nice about me. So, that happened. Max seemed to like the watch. And then not long after Basel, I remember it was very hot and sunny that year. And not long after Basel, we had a meeting with MB&F, and they, for reasons I've never really understood, seemed interested in me designing some sort of a thing, project, whatever you want to call it, for them. Crazy. So yes, so the perpetual that became the perpetual calendar. What you have to understand is that I had never designed even a complete movement. I designed a handful of modules and little mini projects based on base movements, existing base movements. I'd never designed a complete watch, let alone a highly, highly complicated watch. So in terms of MB&F, they were brilliant because they took a total and utter punt on me. I was completely unknown and untried and unproven that I could do this. They had no idea that I could pull it off. So again, I suppose back to the original HM1 and the problems there. Maybe Max, in working with me then, he seemed to see that maybe I was the sort of person who could see this through. But I had no credentials really or proven track record, to use that horrible phrase, in movement design. They had a go, and I explained to them along the way. I just had this idea about a perpetual calendar. So the answer to your question is, I worked on a perpetual calendar for the very first time on the restoration course in WOSTEP. And I remember getting this watch, and this pocket watch, and this is so exciting. This mythical perpetual calendar mechanism. It's so exciting. And then I remember getting, taking it all apart and getting into it. And I just remember opening it for the first time and taking the dial off and thinking, what? Is this it? That's the thought I had. Is this it? Is this really, it seems so cumbersome. and so clunky, and so like this great big lever, and nothing stays in place properly. And if you do this and that with the correctors, then you can break these teeth and you can damage this. And I was sort of dismayed that it was this sort of unevolved as it was. That was my very first impression when I worked on one for the very first time. Like, it's a beautiful thing, but it's sort of very there seems a great deal of scope for development that, it just hasn't really happened. So it was right from WOSTEP that I thought perpetual calendars, surely we can do better. And I had this idea just knocking around in the back of my head. And so whenever I went to Geneva and I saw Max and Serge for the first time after Basel, whenever they said, let's maybe do something, I didn't have any watch to show them or any sketches or any like clear idea. All I had was this idea in the back of my head that it's totally and utterly illogical that perpetual calendars work. All perpetual calendars work on the basis of 31 being the longest month. And we have a wheel. The conventional perpetual calendar has got a wheel with 31 teeth. That's fine for months with 31 days. But for all the other months, at the end of the month, you have to skip out the days that you don't want. So for September and so on, you have to skip over these days. So that means that as between sort of 10 a.m. and 2 a.m. during the period whenever the calendar is jumping from the end of the old month to the beginning of the new month, there will be a time when your watch reads the 31st of September. It'll read that for like 20 minutes or half an hour, or it'll read the 29th of, the 30th of February. This kind of crap. And I just thought, it's so logical that rather than base it on 31, which only some months have 31 days, base the calendar on 28, because every month in the year has got at least 28 days. Then add in the extra days to each month as and when you require them. So you always have exactly the right number of days in the month. This seemed so logical to me, but I hadn't fleshed the idea out. It was really a sketch in the back of my head. And I went to MB&F in Geneva, and my total pitch was more or less what I've just told you. Even at that point, I didn't even really know how it worked. I had this idea for this wheel, this multi-layered wheel with moving sectors, which is what became the mechanical processor. But I hadn't designed any of it. I hadn't fleshed any of the geometry out. It was just literally ideas. And on the strength of that, they said, instead of telling me to leave and never coming back, they said, okay, let's do it.
So you've got this idea, you have the concept, you have it sketched out in your head. What is your creative process like from this idea in the back of your head to bringing this to reality? Because I think one thing I'd like people to understand about watchmaking is it's not a short process. It's not a quick and easy sort of like, oh, okay, I have this idea, I sketch it out in CAD, I test it, it works, yay, let's put this into production. It's a long process with much more complicated steps than I've just broken it down. But I'd love to hear how your creative process sort of works, broadly, or with the LMP as a particular example. Like, you have the idea, what happens next?
The idea is there. The idea popped into my head years before, after I'd been playing around with the watches and WOSTEP, The idea was just there about the 28, but that's all it really was, 28, and what can you do with this 28? And I suppose I thought about it a lot, and the idea of the moving sectors inside the multi-layered wheel seemed interesting, but again, I didn't really know if this would work. So with watchmaking, I developed it. Usually what happens it was the same with the last projects I've done as well. I usually will find that before I really put pen to paper properly, before I actually start to design anything, that I could show you anything in CAD or any sketches, like actual sketches of stuff. I think about it a lot. I think about, like, it was the same with the chronograph, the sequential chronograph. I thought about the chronograph on and off for probably about 2 years, just in my head, and I'd mapped out some of how it's all going to work in my head, but there was nothing to show, So that process had already been going on in the back of my head, I suppose, for a couple of years. And so I had some feeling for this multi-layered wheel. That seemed to be the key to it all, but I hadn't, when I went to see Max and Serge in Geneva, I had nothing to show them except I just had an explanation, But I think so once I had some notion of what I was aiming for, this multi-layered wheel, that was the key to it. So as soon as they said, okay, let's do it, and then I began actually to work on it, it really began with, there's always a central point in the project. The central point is like if you like, it's the most dangerous and difficult part of the whole thing. You begin there and everything, and then you sort of move outwards from that. So in the case of the perpetual calendar, the most difficult and dangerous bit, the heart of the whole mechanism, is that multi-layered wheel, and how the levers and the different parts of the main section of the calendar, how they interface with that wheel. So I started with the calendar, and in particular, I started with the wheel and the operating lever, and the lever which communicates with the month cam down at the bottom, down towards 6 o'clock. Those are the most highly constrained and problematic elements of the entire watch. There's no point in starting with the basic movement or the power reserve mechanism, or any of those. The balance, even that all follows much later. You start with the bit which is most likely to go wrong. Effectively, I'm always looking in these projects for something which, there's always, this is what I found with these things as well, Todd, there's very often things lurking in an element of the mechanism which I haven't spotted or haven't thought of. And any of these things could potentially knock over the entire house of cards. And what I mean is that there could be something lurking, there could be an Achilles heel or a weakness or a limitation somewhere in the mechanism that I haven't spotted. And it could be that thing, if it turns out to be insoluble, it could derail the entire project. It could kill the project stone dead. I'm always looking for that thing that I haven't thought of. And in both the perpetual calendar and in the sequential chronograph, there have been episodes exactly like that, which fortunately were solved in the end, but the road to solving it was incredibly difficult and stressful. And it's dealing with those things, which, exactly to come back to your question, it's in dealing with those things that takes up a huge amount of the development time, because whenever you start to flesh the idea out, you start to actually design the CAD and design, you start with the geometry. The first thing I do is the geometry. I'll spend, with something like the perpetual calendar, I'll spend literally weeks and weeks and weeks just drawing geometry, model any parts. I'll just do geometry, because the geometry is the underlying proof, if you like, of how the whole thing works, how the levers interact with each other, how the wheels, how everything goes is all geometry. Ultimately, it's geometry. Every lever has a pivoting point. You draw everything out just in literally sketches and lines. Once everything starts to come together geometrically, then you can start to actually model some components and see what the parts might look like. But the very first thing is just literally thousands of lines and circles and arcs and stuff, So as you flesh that out, you start to think, okay, well, there could be something there, or there could be something there. And have I not thought of something here? And there's always this possibility of a gremlin lurking, which is going to derail the whole process. But the process advances like that. Then you start to have some parts, and it starts to look like something. And then it even starts to look a bit like a watch. And if the thing is right, each part as it goes along, I always get the feeling that I feel that if I've done it right, in terms of your question about the creative process, if I've got what I'm looking for, it always feels as though the part of where it was, the part of whatever it is, it already existed. It's like it's hidden under sand, and what I'm doing is I'm pouring the sand away, and the first wee corner appears above the sand, and then I pour a bit more away, and gradually you see more emerge. And if I've done it right, I'm always looking for this kind of gut punch feeling, like that's what I'm looking for. I'm always looking for this kind of visceral reaction, and if I get that, then I'm happy that that's how that spring is supposed to look, or this lever or whatever, it should be a feeling. It's like any good idea. It should be like, once you see it, it should be like, well, it's so obvious. It always existed. I'm looking for that, exactly that feeling. It should look as though it always existed.
Yeah. And is it a great relief to find those solutions when you're working on something and you're stuck or you're hung up on it? Or does it feel a bit like you were just saying, like, oh, this is so obvious. Like, why didn't I see this from the beginning?
No, it's agony. No, not at all. Not at all. No, because again, you see, it's the nature of trying to work with all those watches have got, they're completely new mechanisms. So the perpetual calendar is all patented, and the sequential chronograph has got like 5 patents and stuff. And because you're really in the realms of sort of untried stuff, even the best computer modeling it's extremely useful, of course, and there's an awful lot you can see, but ultimately you can't really be sure it's going to work until you get to try it, and that means build the prototype. And it's a hugely long process. I mean, for me to give you an idea, to design, if we design the perpetual calendar, I mean the entire watch, not just the perpetual calendar mechanism, but the entire watch, I have to get to the point that really I've designed the entire watch before we can start to prototype stuff. And in order to prototype stuff, that's a thing which is done in partnership with MB&F. If I was to make every single component of that watch here in my workshop, it would take me about 5 years. So I can't make everything. It's just not possible. I make all the really dangerous bits, the bits that we're pretty sure are not going to work first time around. So we have a sort of a triage, hedging your bets sort of system. So once the watch is fully designed, we will choose the parts which are high risk, medium risk, and low risk. All the low risk bits, things like the screws, things like main gear train, and all that sort of stuff, we can be confident those are going to work. So MB&F will straight away order those in reasonable quantities, in the hope that the overall watch does work in the end, and they can actually launch it as some sort of a product onto the market. So we will, because obviously the whole point is that the more you order, the less expensive it's going to be, because there's huge economies of scale when you're trying to get components supplied. So we'd rather than order one screw, we'd much rather order 5,000 screws, etc., etc. So we try to work out high, medium, and low risk components, and straight away order more significant quantities of the low risk components, and a few of the medium risk and the high risk stuff I make here myself. So it takes a lot longer, but there's no point ordering all these springs and levers if we're 90% sure they're all going to end up in the bin, because stuff like springs, for example, you always have to tweak the springs, change the thickness, alter the heights. There's a lot to do in things like springs. So I make all those parts here myself. So along this but the point is, you can't get to the point where you can order those parts and be ready to go with prototyping. You must first of all complete the entire design of the entire watch. You can't just design a bit of it and say, okay, well, we'll make some bits. In order to have this assessment of high, medium, and low risk, you have to have everything clear. So that means I've got to design the entire watch, everything, all of the basic movement, all of the screws. The whole thing is completely finished. All the bevels are in place. All the decoration's been decided. And then I have to do all the technical plans. So that means every single component has got its own fully spec'd out and fully toleranced technical plan, which allows the supplier or whoever it is to make that component. So that is a huge amount of work. And I'm just here in my little organization working by myself. There's nobody else here except me, so to do the complete design from start to finish of a highly complicated watch. The perpetual calendar is like 582 components. The sequential chronograph, something similar, 585 maybe. It's around, if I do nothing else but that, it's about 2 years of work just to get the design fully done and I've done all the technical plans, and now I've delivered the complete dossier to MB&F. And at that moment, not before, can we then start to even think about the prototyping. And then for the prototyping, we decide which components are they going to order, which components am I going to make, and then the process continues. You see, so you're talking really in years here, because I don't have a team. I don't have a bunch of people working here with me, and I can put these people on this project and somebody else is working on this project. It's just me. I don't have. I could never. My level of anxiety is so out of control that I just couldn't have other people working for me. I would drive them mad because I would never be satisfied with what they're doing, and they would drive me mad because I would torment them all the time. So it's just me here, and I can't compress my time anymore because I'm already working far too much. So this is how long it takes for one person to design a watch like that from start to finish, and then do all the technical plans, deliver all those to MB&F, and then the machinery then with MB&F, then they kick in, and then they order, or they get all the parts. The supply of all the parts comes in, and then I make my prototyping parts, and then we come together again and start to build the prototype. And only then, to answer your question, we're now more than maybe 2.5 years into the project. So I've been on eggshells for 2.5 years, and only now, after 2.5 years, do I finally get to build the prototype and see if the flipping thing works or not. Do you see?
And when you are working on the technical dossier and building all of the planning and the parts and sort of the build dossier, Do you enjoy the prototyping of those hard parts, of those high risk parts? Like, do you enjoy the fabrication side as much as you enjoy the deeply technical thinking and development side?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I do, because in my heart, my background is really watchmaking, and as I say, what I mean is the actual working with the bits of metal. The actual the mechanisms themselves, manipulating them, making the parts, putting them together, all that sort of stuff. That's the world I'm from. So I kind of ended up in this design business, designing parts sort of again by accident. But really in my heart, I still feel like I'm sort of a watchmaker. So the more that I do, I'm very busy with design now. But when I do a lot of design, but I really enjoy getting back to the actual physical in the metal bit of the watchmaking. So when I'm at the prototyping and all, then I love all that. And I've got all the machines whirring, and that's really I'm in my element at that. But nonetheless, the flip side of that is that it is also very stressful, because uh, if I find that it's at that point that I find out if it's working or not. And if it's not working, then it really is because I don't have a very good sense of perspective in my life. So it consumes me to such an extent that I find it very hard to really keep, to not get in such a huge panic about stuff when things aren't going when things aren't working in the way I want them to. It's not just a job that I do, and that if it works, that's fine. I take it also personally that it's very difficult to really, as I say, keep a sense of emotional and psychological perspective on what is effectively just a mechanical watch. Nobody's life is at stake, but my reaction to it is disproportionate and entirely out of all proportion.
Yeah. And I think that that's something that I'm happy you said that, because I want people to understand how much this means to you and how important this work is to you. Because when we were talking before this, and in emails we've exchanged and in conversations we've had before, we've talked about how challenging this work is. And I think that's something that everyone can relate to, because many people love what they do, but there are also times when it's immensely stressful and terrible, and it consumes you, and it's all consuming. And then you get through that, and sometimes there's relief there, and sometimes there's not. And sometimes it's just like, okay, well, you've gotten through this thing, now back to the normal day to day. And it's relatable for everyone, because it's hard to do when you go through these extremely emotionally trying periods, and periods where you're trying something that has never been done before, and you don't know if it's going to work or not. But I'm really happy to hear you say that, because I think it's relatable to everyone. And it's
And you
not
have to
easy
understand
to.
as well, as I say, let's say the 2 to 2.5 years, where like MB&F, everybody, the whole thing's a punt, the whole thing's a gamble. We could, and then this is what happened. This is why both of those watches were so horrendous in their own way, is that we got to the point of actually building the prototype, and for totally different reasons. For both watches, they're entirely different stories. What went wrong, but in both those cases, we built the prototype, and it didn't work at all. And so think about how much time I've invested. Think how much money MB&F have invested in the project, and the whole thing is really on my shoulders, because it's just, again, back to the point that it's just me here. There's nobody else here. I don't. MB&F are great in that they support me, but I'm not. I don't. I'm not. I work here alone in Belfast. I'm not. I'm not part of. I'm with them, but I'm not part of their company. So I take total responsibility for what I do and for the thing ultimately working. So, and I take that responsibility very, very, very seriously, Todd. So it's a huge amount of time to wait, to be in agony, to find out if a thing's going to work. But then, if you reach that point and you build a prototype and find that it doesn't work, and in both those cases it didn't didn't work, this really is the worst case scenario. It's very hard to it's very hard to describe unless you've been through it. But it's really the ultimate torment.
And what's the process then of, you hit that sort of failure point, what's the process then of backtracking to find what the problem is, or how do you go back and say like, okay, well, this isn't working the way we anticipated? How do you break down a movement then to figure out where the disconnect is?
Okay, well, the answer to that, the two projects are entirely different. So if I answer that in terms of the perpetual calendar, is that what you?
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, that's great. A live example would be amazing.
The perpetual calendar had right from the early days of designing the first few months. Let's say even the first 2 months of beginning the design actually properly on CAD. I was aware that there was a if you like there was a absolutely key pivotal area, and it was to do with the way the multi-layered wheel, the mechanical processor, programs itself on the 25th of each month. So there's a specific thing happens on the 25th at midnight, and the system is programmed, and then it programs itself for the present month. And then after that, the month and year correctors switch themselves off, so you can no longer mess with it after the 25th. So obviously the thing has to program itself correctly. And I was worried that I could see that there was a weakness in what I designed and that I wasn't sure would it do that. So there's a lever which communicates with the month cam. The lever comes to rest in the right place, but for the programming of the multi-layered wheel to be correct, there's a pin inside that wheel which controls those moving segments. And the lever stops in the right place, but the program is only right if the pin is leaning against the lever. And the problem is, and this is why the computer modeling is so limited, this instance happens very fast. It's a violent action. It happens with a bang. So whenever you go to the 25th, the lever's released, the lever flies down at high speed, bangs into this pin, the lever stops in the right place, but the pin is free to sail off and jump around and do whatever it likes because the pin is free. The lever stops here, but the programming's only right if the pin is leaning against the lever whenever this happens. If the pin finishes up somewhere over here, the programming's wrong. And I had, what I'd done is I put in these braking levers and a spring, like an inertia spring, which I had thought would work well, would act like a brake. So whenever the lever flies in and whacks the pin and moves it sideways, the pin will always be slowed down. It'll have a braking effect due to other things. And I had thought, well, that ought to do it. I worried about this. I worried about this for over a year. Every single day for over a year, I knew that this was a weakness because if this doesn't work, there's the whole thing's useless. Yeah, and I don't just mean we can work around it. I couldn't find a way to work around it. I tried for over a year. What I wanted was a fail-safe solution. Rather than use braking springs and stuff like that, I wanted a way which would mean that the pin couldn't be anywhere else but leaning against the lever. I wanted to make it like a brick wall solution, rather than a spring. I wanted to find this brick wall solution, and I couldn't find it. I made friends with a guy who is actually there's a huge textbook. If you study watchmaking, if you study construction, if you go to university in Switzerland, you study watch construction, which is the design stuff. There's a huge textbook, and he's one of the guys who wrote the book, and I became friends with him. I made contact with him, and I said, look, you've never met me before, but he was a semi-retired teacher then, and I said, look, would you look at this problem for me and see what you think? And he and I became friends. He's a very nice chap. I explained it all to him. He went away and analysed it, and he said, actually, in terms of the brick wall solution, he said that because of the contra-rotating nature of these components, that can't really exist. He said you're not going to get that. But he did say that the spring and everything I put in, he thought that all looks plausible and that should work fine. But I always had this question mark: what's going to happen here? What's going to happen? Because of it's a dynamic modeling problem. You can only find out what it's going to do when everything's moving at high speed and you have this very high speed impact collision. You can't model that with a computer, really. So we built it, and of course it didn't work at all. It was an absolute disaster. The spring didn't work, the braking didn't work, nothing worked. And I had no workaround. And this guy had told me there can't be the brick wall solution you're looking for. And it really was a disaster. And I had this awful feeling. I rang MB&F, and I was literally in tears. And I told them, look, it doesn't work. I can't make it work. It doesn't work. And I Sarah said, okay, calm down. So it was sort of like, calm down. This was like a Wednesday or Thursday. I tried all sorts of things. I'd remade the spring 3 or 4 times, different thicknesses. Nothing worked. And he said, look, calm down. He said, let's think it over for a few days and we'll talk again next week. And then this was maybe like a Thursday or Friday. I went drinking all weekend, and then I was sitting here in the workshop, right in the seat where I'm talking to you now, and I was sort of a bit hungover on Monday morning. And the solution just dropped out of the sky into my head. And I had it redesigned in about 3 hours. I had redesigned by lunchtime. And then it was only really a small modification. It was a new opening in the wheel and an extension to the month follower lever. So what it did was it was another pin, an additional pin, which comes up elsewhere on the wheel, and this lever catches the oncoming pin, and effectively the pin is then sandwiched between the two levers, so it can't move. It ends up jammed between the two levers, it worked. It worked perfectly. It worked from the very first. We had to get that part made, but from the very first time I tried it, it worked perfectly. But so I'm delighted with the outcome. But I mean, it was like being trapped in hell.
Yeah. The turmoil of just actually making the thing work, because you can't see it work statically. And not knowing probably is the most anxiety provoking part of the entire endeavor.
And you just can't be sure until you actually get to try it. So with each of these, when I have each of these experiences told that goes badly, okay, the watches have worked out well, but with each experience, sort of with each difficult emotional experience, I become more and more, it undermines more and more my sort of confidence, so I'm more and more nervous and, very racked with self-doubt with all these things,
Does it make you want to do something different? Like, does it make you want to focus on time only or clocks or go into something else?
Yeah, I'd love to be a bus driver or a postman.
So I had heard from a mutual friend that at one point you were considering being a lorry driver, and there was I think farmer or gardener was thrown out there as well. Of course, I was speaking about Luca, who said
Luca, yeah,
there was a point where you called him and said, "I'm thinking about being a lorry driver," understood. But what I mean, you're obviously keeping going. So what? I know we can't talk about future projects, but is watchmaking just so in your blood that it's and it sort of fixates your mind that you have to do it?
Yeah, I always say I'm sort of driven by forces that I can neither control or understand. That's how it feels. I mean, even if I wasn't, even if I wasn't doing watchmaking professionally, I would still have to do it privately. It's like an addiction. Really, that's how it feels. But with all the negative connotations of an addiction, and that, I don't know. As I said to you before, I feel like I can't live with it yet. I can't live without it. But it doesn't bring me joy or pleasure at all. I don't get immense satisfaction from it. It's just like I don't know. It's like it relieves a craving. Maybe that's what I get from it. It's not I don't get a wonderful glowing feeling of, oh, this is fantastic. It's not that at all. But why do I keep going with it? I don't know, because it's very hard to imagine I don't have watchmaking in my life. I don't know what that would look like. I don't know.
Do you take a break between projects, or do you go straight from one project into the next project?
Pretty straight, yeah. Because I'm sort of there was I would organize it in such a way that there might be a bit of a lull, in that I'm not straight away into conceiving the next one, back to back. But because there's always a lot of sort of follow up work on to the back end of the previous project, there'll be a lot of sort of follow up work, because we do like different versions of the watch, and there might be some new things that are some variants, maybe, that sort of stuff. So I would do a lot of that sort of work, which is really interesting, but it's not the super high risk stuff, before launching into the next one. But meanwhile, of course, while I'm doing that not quite so high risk stuff, I'll already be thinking about what's going to come next, So I already started to work on the new one in my head long before, as I explained earlier, long before I actually sit down and start to work on it. So there's I suppose it's not a break, but it's more of a lull, I suppose. But I do feel as if I'd like 6 months holiday, definitely.
Yeah. So I kind of want to come back to your workshop, your one-man workshop, and how did you get all of your sort of tools, your bench, everything back from Switzerland to Northern Ireland? And did you find a workshop, or do you work at home? I'm sort of curious about how your workshop came together.
Well, yeah, when I was still at WOSTEP, as I said, I did lots of moonlighting, so I would work for a year and then buy one piece of equipment and then another bit the next year, So gradually I accumulated all the bits and pieces that I have here, because it really the whole aim was to be independent in the sense that I'm able to make pretty much any component that I need for watches. I wanted to be totally not reliant on any sort of supplier. So again, that's why, to come back to the prototyping thing, that's why I can do all that sort of stuff here. Because if you say we're again on the high, medium, and low risk components, there's lots of components at MB&F they might wait a year to get. They might wait 8 months. There's very long lead times in components, depending on the suppliers. So if I'm in the middle of my prototype and I realize, okay, suddenly, as I did multiple times, for each of those projects, I've got a scrap box behind me in the bench. It's like the graveyard box, I always call it. It's all the stuff all the bits that weren't right, and that can run into maybe nearly 100 components that are all just scrapped. So if I need a spring and I realize, okay, I need the spring to be 5/100 of a millimeter thicker than I originally designed it. If I have to wait, 11 weeks to get the spring back from Switzerland, that's no good. Only to try it and realize, actually, yeah, I still need to make it 5/100 thicker again. Another 11 weeks, it doesn't work. So here I have everything I need. I can make all the components in the workshop. So that means if I need a new spring, I can redesign the spring in the morning, run it on the machine, and have it by lunchtime the same day. But I don't have any capacity in terms of production. So if it takes me 4 hours to make that spring, it'll take me 40 hours to make 10 springs. I have no economy of scale at all because I've got all manual machines. But it means I can be extremely reactive, particularly in the prototype. So I have everything I need here to do and pretty much any component you like. And that was the aim, was to reach that point. So now that I'm free from the need to operate with any supplier. That was the whole plan. So yeah, I had to accumulate all this equipment that I have here, but getting it home was tricky because we just got I remember with my wife, we got like a moving, like an international moving company, and they came and they visited and they looked around and they gave us a quote for like something totally astronomical, like £30,000, to move all this stuff home. And I thought it was just not possible, So anyway, we asked a company here in Belfast, could they do it? And they were like, well, yeah, we've never really done anything like that before. But yeah, they said they could do it. So I wasn't really sure they could do it, but they said they could do it. And they arrived with a big lorry, and it cost a fraction of, I don't know, far, far, far less than that. And they came, and I have to say, the guys were absolutely brilliant. And they brought all the stuff, arrived here in Belfast, and there wasn't a single solitary scratch on any piece of equipment in the entire workshop. Nothing. It was amazing. I don't know how they did it. I wouldn't like to do it again, but touch wood. On that occasion, I was lucky.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any desire to sort of be an independent, what you might think of as an independent watchmaker, somebody who's making watches and putting your name on the dial, start to finish?
I don't know. I find that hard to answer. Again, I think it's because I struggle a great deal with anxiety, is the honest truth, and Max and Sarah think that's part of the reason I'm good at what I do, maybe. But I suppose it's, as I say, to come back to what you said right at the start, yeah, you're right. My interest is in the really deeply technical side of stuff, So the advantage of the arrangement how I operate at the minute is that because I'm not doing anything really for myself, I'm left alone here. Nobody bothers me. I'm here in the workshop all the time, and I get to develop all the stuff, and I make the parts, and I do everything. And that's what I really enjoy. Whereas if I was more commercially involved, then I would inevitably spend a lot more time, chasing clients. And I'm sure if you talk to any of the independents who are like independent brands, they spend a great deal of time traveling and going to see people, and all sorts of stuff, like collectors and events, and going to all the big fairs and so on. I don't really do any of that. You and I met in Geneva a few weeks ago, but that's, as I think I explained to you at the time, for me, that's extremely rare that I'm ever at any events like that. Like I'm hardly ever at, I don't really do things like that at all. So it was, for the fact that we met was a stroke of luck, but generally speaking, I suppose I'm quite private, and I keep myself hidden away here. So I suppose that's part of what suits me about working with the sort of development work that I do at the minute. I'm left alone to do that, and I'm not saying it won't happen, but I certainly have to think very carefully about becoming more, I suppose, commercially involved and doing something under my own name. I just that would be a big step, and I just don't know about that.
Yeah, fair. Stephen, I want to be respectful of your time. We've taken a bit of it this morning, but I would love to kind of end with two questions. The first one is, I'd love to hear about your love of clocks. I know clocks were always of interest to you, but one of the things we spoke about in Geneva were Harrison's marine chronometers. I'd love to hear just your take on Harrison's marine chronometers, and what you would love to see, if you would ever love to make a clock of your own.
Well, Harrison, yeah. So I think I'm a huge Harrison fan. I just think those clocks I think they are the most extraordinarily overwhelming, emotional, mind-blowing horological artifacts anywhere. I just think that is the shit right there, is Harrison's clocks, and the three clocks on the watch, obviously, So I was just after, so you and I spoke in Geneva. I had been traveling over Geneva a couple of days before, and I had got stuck because my flight had to fly through London because there's no direct flights from Belfast to Geneva. So I got stuck in London. My flight was cancelled in Geneva. I ended up spending 2 nights in London, and I stayed with a friend. And on the Saturday, I went to Greenwich to see Harrison's clocks, which I've been there many times before. It was not the first visit. I've been many times. I've still got my. I think I've still got my. There's my ticket, Todd. Look at that. There you go.
That's amazing.
So right, yeah. So I went. I spent. So that was I did that on Saturday. I got there about 12 o'clock midday, and the Greenwich Observatory is incredible. If anybody goes and visits, it's incredible. They've all this incredible paraphernalia from the era of whenever Greenwich obviously has the prime meridian of the world. There it's an extremely historic and interesting place. They have all the old telescopes and all that sort of stuff. It's a super cool place to look around. But I got there about 12 o'clock, and I had to look around. And the room where they have all the clocks are in the center of the room. And I looked all around the edge of the room first at all this other information, And because I knew the clocks are there, and I've seen them so many times before, and I sort of was building myself up to get to look at the clocks, so emotional. And then I turned around and started to look at the first one, and I mean, it's incredible. All the people come and go and look, and I just spent ages looking at the clocks, 1, 2, 3, and then eventually I'm standing in front of the watch, and honest to God, the tears are running down my face. They're the most sublime objects. So I was in that room with the clocks for like 6 hours. I got there at midday, and I was the last person to leave, and they kicked me out when the museum closed at 6 o'clock. I was just in all day long, just looking at them. And I've been there many times before, and there's always the nature of their wonder is that there's always some new detail or something you hadn't spotted before, or something because the cool thing about the museum is they have the 3 clocks all operating. They're all running, so you can actually see them running. They're not just static. The watch is static. it doesn't run because it requires oil, so they can't run it. But the 3 clocks don't require any oil because Harrison was so clever. They have them all running so you can watch what they're doing, and particularly 2 and 3, you can see how the remontoirs wind every, I think one of them's every 4 minutes and the 3 is every minute or something. There's so much detail in how he did the compensation mechanisms and with the bimetallic whole system, it's just incredible if you think about the stuff that he invented. What I love about Harrison is that what he did was completely groundbreaking. He wasn't just somebody doing good clocks. He was literally light years ahead of everything else which was going on in his era. And he did all that. Like, it's hard enough doing it today. We've got all these modern machine tools and we've got all this stuff. Harrison had no electricity. He had no modern machine tools. He had no high quality optics. He had no electric light. And the guy was completely self-taught. He was a carpenter, and he came up with these things which were literally, there is to this day, there's no comparison to what he did in the era that he did it. He invented the bimetallic strip. He invented the ball bearing. I mean, imagine that every machine, every motorbike, car, engine, whatever you name it, is stuffed full of ball bearings, right? And he invented that just to make his clocks run with less friction. It's absolutely brilliant. It's the most incredible story, and I'm overwhelmed by it. And every time I go there, I'm equally overwhelmed. Again, I just think it's the most interesting thing ever. Harrison's the man.
Does it ever make you want to build a clock of your own?
Yeah, well, I'm very interested in clocks, as you say, but the clocks would only be clocks would be a private interest. That's something not to do for other people, but I'm also really interested in to have these clocks here. Look over here. I'm going to show you. See up on the wall there? Yeah. So I have all these master clocks. I'm really interested in master clocks. So master clocks are clocks which you don't get anymore. But imagine the era before mains electricity or quartz. So I'm talking like sort of the early 19th century. The master clocks were prevalent from the early 19th century until the arrival of quartz in the 70s. So imagine you've got a big building or complex of buildings like a school or a factory. You have all these different rooms. So imagine it's a school and you need to know all the time in all the different classrooms. So if you have a mechanical clock on each wall, you have to wind them up and people forget and they all go at different speeds, So that's no good. So you have a master clock system. So you have one very, very accurate clock in the school office, and it communicates with all the slave clocks in all the different classrooms. So the slave clocks have no autonomy at all. They're just they receive an electrical pulse in a big loop of wires from the master clock every 30 seconds. So they don't know what the time is. They just jump forward whenever the master clock says jump. So the master clock itself is an incredibly accurate and beautiful, highly engineered, but extremely modest piece of equipment, you see. There were great pioneers in England, companies like Synchronome, and there's a bunch of about 4 or 5, real experts in this stuff, And I'm obsessed with master clocks, totally obsessed with master clocks. I'm not so interested in the slave clocks, but what I love about the master clocks is that they're so accurate, like in-bar pendulums, all this kind of stuff. I have a huge collection. I've got about 11, although only 5 are working. I've got 3 more in the kitchen. That's the clunk that you can hear every 30 seconds. I don't know if you can hear, there's a noise, but that's the master clocks resetting every 30 seconds. So it's an electromechanical clock, which is highly accurate. And mine run to within 1 or 2 seconds a month. They're incredibly accurate, they're really brilliant. But what is so cool about that is that the Synchronome company in England, who was doing these clocks, they also did a thing called the short free pendulum clock. And the master clock is very accurate and very interesting. But they wanted to. This is in the era whenever this is again the 1930s, 40s, 50s. This kind of thing. They're trying to get the most accurate clocks on the planet for really hyper precision timekeeping. So the problem with any pendulum clock is that it's interfered with by its escapement or by the mechanism it uses to advance the mechanical parts. So a master clock is really very good because it's free for 29 seconds out of the month, but it still gets influenced by the main escapement. It still gets impulse rather. So the free pendulum clock is a double clock. It's one pendulum in a vacuum, and it's a master clock which functions like a slave clock, and the two of them are linked together with a feedback loop. It's incredibly clever. So the problem with a normal pendulum is a normal pendulum will change its rate in terms of temperature, air pressure, air viscosity, air buoyancy. All these things have an effect on the pendulum. So the very accurate pendulum is inside an evacuated cylinder. at a constant temperature. But it can't tell the time because it's just a pendulum. So what allows the system to tell the time is linking the evacuated pendulum with a master clock, which functions like a slave clock. The two work together, and the slave clock triggers when the master clock should be impulsed, all this sort of stuff. Anyway, the point is, Synchronome came up with this system along with a guy called William Hamilton Short, who was a railway engineer who lived in his mum's house, and he designed all the clocks in his bedroom. And he's an unbelievably clever chap, and he's almost unknown. And these clocks were so accurate that from, say, the 1920s until the 1970s, every major observatory on Earth had a short synchronome free pendulum clock. They made about 70 or 80 of them in total. And they're now highly collectible. I wish I had one. I don't. And they were so precise. They were the most accurate clocks on Earth for all that time until quartz came along. And only in the arrival of quartz could anybody measure how accurate they had been. But the clocks were such that if they kept whenever they compared with quartz and kept a record of their rate, the clocks would fluctuate very, very slightly in terms of the rate. And the fluctuation was caused by the moon, by the tides, because the moon very slightly affects the Earth's gravitational field. And the clocks were so accurate that the clocks were able to pick up the tiny changes in the Earth's gravitational field. That's how accurate they were. What about that? So what I would want to do, the answer to your question is, I would love to build I'd love to build a fully mechanical version of a free pendulum clock with so effectively two clocks which feed back one with the other. I'm very interested in that. That's my little retirement project.
Well, I hope you do. I know it will be amazing. And I think you probably will, because it's already in your brain. I can tell that you're already designing it in there.
Well, something's cooking, Todd. Yeah.
Stephen, it's been such a pleasure talking with you, and I'm so glad we had a rather chance encounter in Geneva to get to know each other and to get to talk.
It's cool.
I'd love to ask you one last question, and I'd just like to know what you wish that collectors and people in the watch industry knew about watchmaking.
I suppose it's how can I answer that? My interest is, I always say the same thing. My interest is so very technical. My interest is in the technical side of stuff. I'm not a watch collector. I don't know any collection of. I mean, I love watches, but I don't collect watches. I don't really wear a watch except very occasionally. So my intense interest is really in what's inside watches, how they work, how their mechanisms are designed. I'm interested in all the machinery that is required to create the parts. And that's really what obsesses me. I think that as a result of that, I do all this design work, and as explained, the projects can be very arduous and very stressful, and I struggle a lot with that. And I suppose, just because it's great, of course, people like me are allowed to do what I do because there are interested collectors out there who really like watches, and who also, importantly, it has to be said, they have the means to buy these highly expensive luxury objects, And without those people, we wouldn't be having this conversation. I wouldn't exist. You wouldn't be doing what you do. None of this would happen. And it's very interesting. The field of collecting is very interesting. You know more about this than I do. But there are great people collectors who are really passionate about finding out about the watches that they want to buy, and they have great technical knowledge. And of course, like everything, there's a spectrum. But I suppose sometimes I've come across people who obviously clearly have the means and have absolutely no notion about what the watch is, how it works, who designed it, what went into creating it. It's simply an object, and I feel sometimes it's almost too easy to, just because you have the means to buy it, I think it's not enough of a reason that you should have the right to get one. You should. I think it's because for me it's so personal and emotional. I think that I think I would like people to understand better about what goes into creating something, which in some cases people take entirely for granted.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the most interesting aspects for me from the collecting side, and from what I do from the journalism side, is being able to help educate people about what goes into these watches, and just like this conversation, the different ways to be an independent watchmaker, and the different ways to work independently within the industry, and how the industry really comes together to create watches, because it's not a sole individual effort. There is a lot of team effort. There's a lot of collaboration that occurs, and I think you're absolutely right. It takes a lot to make a watch. And if people spend some time studying that and understanding that, I think the level of appreciation that you have when you have that technical, even a little bit of that technical knowledge, makes your appreciation of the watches and the people so much deeper.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you're right. And if you're the person who owns the watch, it's about love. It's really about love. It's about feeling the person who owns the watch and has it. It's about them feeling some of the love and care that's gone into it in the first place. And if you're the collector, if you don't have that, then you're not getting from the thing that you have. This thing, that's why people own watches or own art, whatever it is. It's an object which you have in your life, which enriches your life in some way, and therefore the more you understand and appreciate the object, be it a watch, be it a painting, be it whatever, a fantastic classic car, the more you understand about what's behind it, ultimately the more joy you're going to take from having the thing in your life. If you know nothing about it, just the fact that you've had the means to buy it and it's sitting there, it doesn't bring you anything. So the more you appreciate about it, the more love is transmitted through the object to the person who gets to enjoy it. So I think there's a two-way benefit. There's a benefit from me, from my side, that I feel that people maybe appreciate more all that goes into it from my side. But there's a benefit also for the person who's the collector, because the joy and benefit that they get from having the thing in their life is increased by a better understanding of what's going on in this. That's the difficulty with watches. It's a small object, so it looks very dense. So it's hard for maybe the person to. I think there's often a fear with watchmaking that people think, well, it's so small and compact, and there's so much going on in there that I'm not even going to try to understand it. But really, it's just mechanics and miniature. If you sit down and really look into it, you can understand what's going on, and I think that's to everybody's benefit. That people, I'd love people to have more understanding of what's going on inside and why it's like that and what went into it.
Absolutely, yeah. Stephen McDonnell, it has been an absolute pleasure speaking with you, like every one of our conversations is. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. I look forward to doing this again with you. And thank you for just being yourself and for everything you've done for the industry. You are an incredible force, and I just want to recognize you for the things that you've created. And I really do think you will be, your name should be known alongside Harrison, alongside Breguet, alongside the great master watchmakers. And I think you will be there. So thank you for your time today.
Todd, thanks very much for having me. It's been a pleasure to speak to you, and we'll speak again.
Absolutely, Stephen. Thanks so much. Talk to you soon.
Good man. Thank you. Bye.